Without further ado, I want to introduce our moderator, Eveline Chao. Evelyn was an Open City Fellow at the Asian American Writers Workshop, and she'll be talking a little bit about that tonight and how it led her to freelance journalism. But she's done a lot of cool things, including write a book about an illustrated guide to Chinese vernacular and slang. Her stories have appeared in the BBC, Rolling Stone, Fast Company, The Daily Beast, Foreign Policy, Atlas Obscura, the New York Times Chinese language site, and the Sydney Morning Herald, among others. She contributes an occasional language column to the LA Review of Books, China Channel, and radio pieces to the BBC's Business Daily. She lived in Beijing from 2006 to 2011 and covered Chinatown for Open City from 2013 to 2014. And she'll be talking today about her interview with Pearl Chow and the histories of flushing that she encountered with her. Please give Evelyn a big round of applause.
Hello. There's like a visual component that I'm waiting for, but thank you to Sophia and to the workshop for having us. This is really amazing to be here. Oh yeah, there it is. So I discovered the amazing awesomeness of oral histories because of the workshop. Because I was doing an Open City Fellowship a few years ago, which Sophia already described. And sort of for long, complicated reasons, they asked if I could find a story in Flushing, although the neighborhood I was covering was actually Chinatown. And I ended up being put in touch with someone named Pearl Chow, who was at the time, 79-year-old who was born in Mississippi, grew up in a Chinese community in Mississippi that existed a few decades ago, and moved up to New York during the 1940s when she was, I forget exactly, but like 9 or 10. And her dad, who's in the photo there, the photo that's like the cover photo for this event, actually that's a childhood photo of Pearl Chow. So she's the one all the way on the left. And that's her parents with her during the 1940s in Flushing when, believe it or not, Flushing was like a mostly white European immigrant neighborhood. So it was just like really incredible to meet this person who had the first generation experience that I had growing up in the US, but like, you know, like 50 years before me. And so when I was interviewing her, there were just like all these little moments that like connected with me so much. Like, you know, she would be talking about her mom who immigrated here from Toisan, and she would say like, oh, like, you know, the older generation, they would never tell us anything. And I was, you know, it really blew my mind to just hear all these things that I always kind of felt about my own upbringing, but from someone, you know, in her late 70s. So that's sort of the context around me doing this interview. So the full interview's on the Open City website, you can see. But I just wanted to play a short audio clip of Pearl speaking, just to give you, I think, a sense of the power of oral history.
It's funny, most children don't have much recall of the other things because the old folks didn't talk about the old things. And my mother was not one to glorify old memories in China, because you would hear the old lady, oh, things are so good over there. My mother says they weren't so good. She never, you know, she didn't live in the past. My mother went to boarding school, which was very unusual in the old days. And she had two friends, and one of them I was named after. In fact, the lady that I was named after, which she became a herbalist, but I don't think she practiced a day in her life. Because one of my friends, one time she came over, and she says, oh my goodness, your mother reads the paper, you know, and Her mother couldn't read the paper. My maternal grandfather must have sent money home for her to go to school. We came to New York shortly after World War II, and we lived in an apartment in Manhattan on fashionable Riverside Drive now. We had always lived in the country in Mississippi, like 5 miles from town, and my mother didn't drive, so she was an isolated person. You know, we just gathered together in town on Sundays for church. You know, that's a social vehicle for people. My mother would have loved to gone to Chinatown to live, but my father was Americanized because he came here when he was 14. So it wasn't important to him to live in Chinatown. He chose to buy a house out here in Flushing.
So that's it, basically. Takeaway, oral histories are amazing. And I think powerful, you know, in a way that sort of distantly written larger review pieces are not always as much. You know, there's just like nothing like a first person account. So anyway, on that note, I wanted to introduce our next speaker, Hoh Yin, who also did an Open City Fellowship with the workshop. Oh no, you're doing it right now, right? Okay. So Huiying B Chan is a writer, multimedia storyteller, and aspiring healer, born and raised in New York City with roots in Chinatown and the Toisanese diaspora. Along with Mei Lum and Diane Wong, who some of you may know of, they facilitate Homeward Bound, a series of public events that uses oral histories to document legacies of resistance and everyday resilience in Chinatowns in New York City, San Francisco, Boston, Los Angeles, Vancouver, Seattle, Lima, Havana, Johannesburg, Ho Chi Minh City, Kuala Lumpur, and Sydney. They recently completed their Open City Fellowship and reported on Chinatown. And they have received fellowships from VONA/Voices and Kairos. And Hoh Yin is currently working as a digital organizer through the Kairos Fellowship. So, round of applause for Hoh Yin.
Thank you. Hey, everyone. Everyone is so silent in the crowd. Thank you. So I'll be using photographs and video clips and sharing parts of my writing to share about my travels to different Chinatowns around the world. Who is doing the slides? Is it Tiffany? Okay. And today I'll be focusing on my time in Cuba, documenting the oral histories of Chinese Cuban grandmothers. So this is my journey in 1 year. For context, after I graduated college, I was awarded a fellowship to do my own project, and my proposal was to travel to Chinatowns around the world, documenting stories of migration and resilience across the diaspora. I mapped out this journey, starting in New York City, going to Latin America, to South Africa, and then China, Southeast Asia, and then ending in Australia. And I chose these countries based on the longstanding histories of Chinese migration, largely from the histories of coolie laborers in the 19th century. The coolie roots kind of just dropped off, like hundreds of thousands of Chinese laborers in a lot of these countries. And so that's the starting point for why each of these countries have a huge Chinese diaspora presence. This project was largely driven by my questions of home. So in trying to find home in the in-between space that is Asian America and creating home with the Chinese diaspora here, I was wondering where others in the diaspora found home and what that looked like. And I knew that I could use Chinatowns as a starting point because of where I've been able to create home here. I also had this question of realizing and seeing the effects of displacement, of gentrification in New York City's Chinatown, and how there was a common theme of that happening across Chinatowns in the United States, from Philadelphia to Boston to San Francisco. And I was wondering, on a bigger global scale, was this happening in other Chinatowns, or is gentrification something that's kind of unique to empires and Western countries? So in month 3, I was in Havana, and I lived in the heart of Chinatown, which today is a predominantly Black community. And for context, Havana used to have one of the largest and oldest Chinatowns in Latin America. You can go to the next slide. And why this is because of coolie labor, and also because at the height of Chinese presence in Cuba, there were over 40,000 people. Thousands of those were Chinese and Chinese Americans who fled the United States during Yellow Peril to escape the racism and xenophobia, and to be part of the diaspora community in Havana, because it was thriving then. This was true until the revolution of 1959 in Cuba, when Fidel Castro came into power, and the country transitioned from capitalism to communism, socialism. And during that transition, the government took back a lot of private businesses, which contributed to Chinatown losing a lot of its core institutions, restaurants, and Chinese people who had gone to who had gone to Cuba to escape communism in China, left Cuba then because they weren't going to stay for that takeover and transition. So as a result, hundreds of thousands, or actually tens of thousands of people left. And the people who stayed were either people who believed in this new government and in the revolution, or they didn't have the means to leave, or it was too dangerous to leave in the ways that were existing. Okay, can you go back one slide? So as a result of that, over these decades, the Chinatown in Havana has lost a lot of its core institutions. There used to be a lot of Chinese theaters, restaurants, dim sum places, pharmacies, schools, supermarkets, and today there is really none of that left. In the whole country, there are fewer than 120 Chinese from China, which people call chinos naturales in Spanish, natural Chinese, but there are over hundreds of thousands of descendientes chinos, or Chinese descendants, throughout the country who are mixed race. So in my time there, I was kind of set out to find the people who are left, even though the impression of Havana's Chinatown is that there are no Chinese left there. And you can go back one. Maybe I'll point. So in my time living in Chinatown and wandering around, I ended up finding La Casa de los Abuelos, which is the senior center equivalent, part of the Longkong Association. There's a small handful of Chinese associations left that are hundreds of years old, and this one runs a food senior center type where dozens of seniors go each day for breakfast and lunch, and then they provide food that they can take home for dinner. And this is kind of sponsored by the government, but also an effort from the Chinese Association to serve its diaspora population there. So from there, I was able to build a lot of relationships with the elderly people by literally sitting at the table and talking to them in Spanish and Cantonese, and they would invite me to eat their senior lunches. And eventually it was being reported to the president that this young Chinese person was getting free meals at the senior pantry. But that was really my intro to developing these relationships. From there, people invited me to the things they did in Chinatown. One was Chinese lessons. These would be weekly Chinese lessons where everybody is over the age of 70, and everyone is Chinese Cuban learning Mandarin for the first time. In an effort to connect to their roots, they may or may not have relatives to talk to, and also as a fun pastime. The classes were filled with a lot of vibrant laughter and just joking and respecting and disrespecting the teacher, who's Ramon in the white shirt. These are some of the women who I was able to interview. All of them are grandmothers. And I talked to them about memories of Chinatown before and after the Cuban Revolution, as well as documented their preservation efforts of Havana's Chinatown in a way where it's really led by elderly mixed race folks, but because of how people see who is and isn't Chinese and who is or isn't like in the spotlight when people talk about like leaders in the community, their work often wasn't highlighted. And to introduce some of them, at the top, this is Maria del Carmen. I call her the unofficial historian of Havana because over these decades, she's really taken it upon herself to collect probably the biggest photo archive of Chinese Cuban history by asking friends and friends of friends. And on the bottom are Jorgina y Caridad. They're both Cantonese opera singers, and they learned how to do so when they were in elementary school, at a Chinese school. And the context for that is there were a lot of Chinese theaters, but a lot of the Cantonese opera performers were leaving with troops to the United States where they could make more money. So there was a shortage of performers, but a huge demand for it. And so people started teaching Chinese descendants how to like sing in Cantonese, and that's where they learned Chinese. Next is a clip that I will play. It's an interview with Maria del Carmen, and she talks about what Chinatown was like before the revolution when she was growing up eating in El Pacifico, which is one of the biggest restaurants that were there. And for one more context, she talks about fondas, and fondas are these. Before fancy Chinese restaurants, there were these small, inexpensive, really barren like food places where people could go for fresh produce. There were no menus, but everyone in the community in Chinatown like knew what you could order and what you could get there. And so she talks about fondas.
Pero había muchas fondas aquí. Uy, sí, como 5. Que recuerde yo que cocinaban muy bien, muy bien. Y rápido, uy, este barrio tenía mucha entrada y salida de personas, de todo.
¿Y qué comía el Pacífico?
Ay, Dios mío, arropito, chow mein, chop suey, una sopa que es así como de maíz, de sopa de mariposita, otra que se le echaba un huevo crudo así, se vuelve así, yo no sé cómo le llaman, porque yo iba y yo comía, pero yo no. Y el arroz frito, especial, rico, con camarones, pollo, carne ahumada, el choricito, ay, choricito chino, Dios mío, ay, más nunca he podido volver a comerlo. Cuando veo Shanghái así, que tiene afuera los mercados llenos de ensarta de chorizo, la boca se me hace agua. Rico, sí, cómo no. Bueno, eso es el Pacífico, lo mejor que había. Un restaurante muy bueno. Y bueno, ahora sí no hay. Sí, hay algunos. La flor del otro, bueno, esos son de ahora. Y demás. Mucha pizza.
Sí,
mucha pizza. Ay, Dios mío.
So I really love Maria del Carmen, and I Skyped her like the other day when it was her birthday. But like what really strikes me about like speaking with her and talking to folks in Cuba was that these foods that I consider staples in Chinese culture and ones that I can get whenever I want in Chinatown were these memories that were really decades old. And so there was like a certain heaviness to that. And in my time in Cuba, seeing how it was a Chinatown that was gutted of a lot of its core institutions, it showed me what a Chinatown could look like post-displacement or post all of the changes that we're trying to prevent from happening in New York City and across Chinatowns in the US. This is a piece/notebook writing that I will read to you about all of that. I kind of like for the grandmothers. I wish you could come with me. I wish you could see that the dream you had is alive, well, and thriving in another part of the world. I wish you could see that all you dreamed of creating is alive and well in New York's Chinatown. The parks are filled with Chinese children running after each other, laughing. A grandpa is lifting his grandson to touch the monkey bars and walking him along as the child's hand touches each one, proud. A grandmother sits at the bench, soft smiling, as her granddaughters, pigtails bouncing, jumps on the keys that create music. In her arm is a white plastic bag holding Peidansao kanji. I am sorry that for you these realities are only memories decades old. I'm sorry that oxtail soup is but a memory. And so part of documenting oral histories and what gets written is also what doesn't get written and whose stories don't get documented. I think in the process, there were always people that I wanted to talk to who didn't feel ready to share stories, who didn't want to share stories, who maybe I didn't have enough of a deep relationship with them, or there was just so much that was preventing them from wanting to tell me, right? And so I think like with any project that has like video clips and poems and products is always this like space for people who don't share. So the next thing I'll read is this interaction I had with Elsa. I call her Elsa Popo. Popo means grandma. When I was walking down the street in Chinatown, and I saw her one day. She was buying a sandwich from like a corner cafeteria because she was going to bring it to her doctor as a present, because their medical treatment and medical care is free. And so as like a thank you and as a gratitude to doctors, like people traditionally bring them like little gifts. So this is me talking to her. I looked over to her, surprised. She wanted so badly to explain to me why she couldn't share her story with me and how sorry she was. In her eyes, I saw my grandmother's. She spoke it almost as a secret, a confession she's realized after a lifetime. She said again, this time as an explanation. To tell you the truth, Cuba is not a bad place. Do you mean the people? I asked her in Cantonese. What did she mean that the country wasn't a broken place? Here, if you don't have money, they still treat you well. In other countries, it's not like that. I wouldn't know, but my friends left the country and told me. There, if you're poor, they don't treat you with respect. Do you understand what I'm trying to tell you? I said, only to reassure her. You can go to the next one. So those were just small snippets of my time, like 2 months out of 12. And when I came back to Chinatown, I met these lovely people, Mei Lam and Diane Wong, and together we've been organizing Homeward Bound series, a series of public events out of Wing On Wo, which is a porcelain shop on 26 Mott Street and the longest running family business in Chinatown, dating back to the 1890s. The current store owner is Mei Lam, who's a fifth generation Chinese American, and she's really transforming the porcelain shop so that it is also a community event space where there is everything about the intersections between arts and activism. So together we have a photography exhibition opening Saturday, November 10th, and also more events coming up. And this is a mandatory reading for those who are interested in how oral histories serve as resistance of two scholar organizers, Diane Wong and Betty Yu. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Huiying. That was amazing. I was trying to walk very slowly up to the stage to give everyone like an extra minute to process all of that because it was so incredible. And then now we move on to our headliner. So I have two introductions to give. So first, maybe I'll first. Oh, okay. Okay. So the author, we're about to see, Fay Hoh Yin, she, in her book, Riding with the Wind, paints an indelible portrait of 3 generations of her family in China as the imperial era ends and war with Japan begins, illuminating the changing roles of women in 20th century China and the United States. Fay was born in Beijing in 1932 to a family of educators. She grew up while China was racked by almost 2 decades of war, first with Japan and then civil war between the Chinese nationalists and communists. She and her family fled thousands of miles to escape the chaos, finally settling in Taiwan in 1949. 2 years later, she came to the US as a foreign student and earned a PhD in biochemistry from the University of Wisconsin. Fay then married Ted Ying in 1958, and they had a son and daughter, Monona, who's here tonight. After being widowed in 1970, she took up international folk dancing, which has remained her passion for more than 40 years. Fay retired in 1991 after working for 26 years as a virologist for the DuPont Company in Wilmington, Delaware. So, welcome, Fay.
Thank you so much, Evelyn, and you, Sophia, and thank you all for coming. I'm really honored. You may or may not know, this book is the only book I've ever written. And I had it published when I was 85 years old. So it's likely, is that okay? Yeah, get a little closer, yeah. So it's likely to be my last book as well, you know. But writing it and having my daughter help me, editing it and publishing it were really important events in my late life. Now, I never set out to write a memoir. After I retired from DuPont, I joined, I call them the old folks school, the Continuing Education Institute in Wilmington. And I took a course on how to write. And my instructor said, write what you know. And I said, yeah, okay. The things that I know the most is my family. Now, growing up in my family, I heard family stories over and over again, just tons of it. And I never tired of listening to it. I know this is not the experience of a lot of the people. Maybe some of you have that experience, that just listening to your parents or older relatives tell you about family stories. So I wrote these stories, and I wrote mostly about family members and their struggles, their sacrifices in a time of tumultuous change in China. So in a way, I was trying to introduce to my children the family, the relatives they've never met or barely knew. And that's how I set out to write about the stories. But through the years, I had accumulated quite a few pieces. I had no idea of ever publishing it. In 2014, I was diagnosed with lymphoma. Then I had a heart failure. And the chemotherapy didn't work very well, and I was told I had 3 months to live. So between the many long years of writing about my families and the final publishing was sandwiched this experience of near death. So my son and my daughter, Monona, and I went through this experience of trying to deal with the issue of me dying and carrying out my instructions of end of life. So this experience is kind of profound for me, and it's irreversibly linked to the book that I'm now published. Okay, so my children got me up to New York City. I went to Sloan Kettering, and I didn't die. They saved me. And so, thank you. Then after I was in the hospital for a long time, then I moved to Monona's house, and she cooked for me, and she encouraged me to finish the writing. It's sort of like a rehab project. And she really pushed me. She became my editor and eventually my publisher. And we've always had a really close relationship, but working together was a real blessing and a joy. So let me see. What do I write about? This is the book. Of course, my parents was a major emphasis. My mother's story was particularly interesting. She was born at the turn of the century. So when China was still in the Dark Ages. At that time, young girls in China, most of them had to have their feet bound because little feet was considered to be a mark of beauty. And also they were denied higher education. Well, my mother was very courageous. She really fought all that treatment. And I want to read a part of that. It's about the foot binding. This was practiced in China for about 900 years. It was a horrible, horrible torture. The atrocious process started when a girl was no older than 6 or 7. A woman whose sole job was this, would closely wrap long strips of cloth around a young girl's feet. The binding was tightened daily, gradually, over 2 years. The relentless pressure of the cloth would break the arch and stop the growth of the feet permanently. The excruciating suffering of generations of defenseless young girls was aptly described by the saying, "Every pair of small feet caused a tub of tears." When my mother's time came, she was far from docile and resisted having her feet bound with all her might. She cried, begged, and raged. Ironically, it was, excuse me, It was a sad responsibility of mothers to ensure that their daughters' feet were bound. Having gone through the torture herself, grandmother agonized over every wail of her small daughters, but had to stand firm. She believed it was her duty as a loving mother to ensure that her daughter's feet were successfully bound so she could marry well. Being innovative, my mother loosened her bindings at night so that she could get a good night's sleep. Then tried to put the strips back on in the morning, hoping that the foot binding lady would notice. Of course, she did, and put an end to that by sewing the strips of cloth together. Mother's feet were swollen in no time, and she said they felt as though they were being grilled on a hot skillet. Finally, after about a month of crying and suffering, my grandfather, thank goodness, my grandfather, I always think him as a closet liberal. He was very progressive in that time. He's much more willing to change with the time. And also, my mom was his favorite. So he couldn't stand all that suffering. Grandfather could stand it no longer. He wanted all the strips of material from mother's feet and threw them into the kitchen stove. My grandmother wailed, "Nobody will marry our daughter now," to which grandfather answered solemnly, apparently hadn't given the matter serious thought. "That is all right. I will keep her for as long as I'm able to. She can go to school, become a teacher, and support herself." And that's exactly what she did. She was the first woman to leave town to study in Shanghai. Eventually, she was sent to study in the US by her school. And that education became the foundation of her long teaching career, 72 years altogether. She's a very well-known teacher. So I am really proud of my parents. My mom, and my dad was also prominent in the field of education. And my aunt, despite the disfiguration of her face by smallpox, she went on to become a well-known dance teacher. And so I'm very proud of them. And I couldn't help but write a little bit about their public life. But most of my story is about them being my loving parents. Let me see. So that's my mom and my aunt. They were a lot of fun. And so we went to Taiwan, and eventually I came to this country. Well, no, I missed something. I also wrote about the Sino-Japanese War. And we were the refugees of our own country, constantly running ahead of Japanese army and trying to dodge their bombs. This is 2,000 miles of our 2,000 miles of our escape, really. So of the 17 years I spent in China, 3/4 was during the war. And when you were a child, that's all you know. War is a constant. And I was just scared all the time. And yet, I had full confidence that my parents would protect me. And they had a long and happy marriage. And I, improbable as it seems, had a very happy childhood. And so then we went to Taiwan, the whole family. And eventually I came to the US. And I went to school, got my degree, married my husband, and had a son and daughter. Happy tale so far. Then my husband died accidentally when he was only 39 years old. So our world came crashing down. Fortunately, I had a wonderful mother-in-law. She was living with us. She was widowed at her young age, and she unfortunately came from a family that's much less progressive than my mother's. So she wasn't able to go beyond junior high school, but she's just as strong as smart, and she devoted herself to us. And she and I formed a partnership that lasted longer than either one of our marriages. Now, so we all loved her, and I know a lot of her stories. Now, when she lost her husband in the 30s, she had to suffer through the archaic tradition of China. So I wrote about that. My father-in-law had just died. The family was overwhelmed with grief, but Yue Fang, that's my mother-in-law's name, Yue Fang alone suffered the hellish life of a widow from that moment on. Her life, as decreed by the customs of upper-class Chinese society at the time, forbade all joy and color. She lived with her son Ted in the big Yin household, a crimeless prisoner with an endless sentence. In old China, widows, particularly the young ones, were considered unlucky, as if they caused the death of their husbands through their fault, their bitter fates. I think all the mourning rituals were designed to torture the widows, thereafter called the one yet to die. Yue Fang wore mourning black for 3 years. For the first 49 days, she was required to call out her husband's name at every mealtime. The custom was to store his sealed coffin for a year before burial, and Yue Fang had to visit his coffin every 7 days. At the end of 3 years, grandfather's son, that's my mother-in-law's father, had a dress made for her. It was gray with splashes of small pink flowers in it. That was the beginning of Yue Fang shedding her mourning black. Again, her mother-in-law didn't like it very much. However, since the dress was given to her by her own mother, her mother-in-law couldn't object. She had wanted to go back to school or work, but at the time, these activities were not socially acceptable for a young widow. Years later, after her mother-in-law died, Yue Fang finally got the chance to work as an accountant in a small firm in Hong Kong. She did that for 10 years until she came to join my husband and me. her abacus. Have you all know what it looks like, the abacus? Yeah, her abacus, which used in her work all these years, still sits on my desk. I remember her right hand flying over it, gracefully pushing the wooden disc up and down along the thin steel rod as if she were playing a musical instrument, making pleasant sound almost like that of a bamboo wind chime. So that's most of what went into this book. These are all just personal stories that I knew. It's only after I finished the book that I realized that each generation passed on their love to the next in whatever way they knew best. And this love fortified their children and then becomes their strength when they face their own hardship. That's all.
Hello? Okay, it works. So I think we are all supposed to ascend to the green couch now. But before we do that, Monona Fay's daughter is going to join us, so I'll just quickly introduce her. Monona Yin is Director of Impact and Learning at Borealis Philanthropy. From 2004 to 2017, she directed capacity building at the Four Freedoms Fund, a national donor collaborative that has invested over $100 million in the immigrant rights movement. As an activist, Monona is a co-founder and former staff director of CAV, Organizing Asian Communities in New York City, which is an amazing organization that does a lot of work in Chinatown, side note. She graduated from Yale and lives in Brooklyn with her husband and daughter. In 2017, Monona edited and published her mother's memoirs, Riding with the Wind, 3 Generations of My Family in China. So welcome to Fay, Monona, and Huiying. I forgot to mention during the intro that Monona just published a piece in the New York Times yesterday called A Dress Rehearsal for the End of Life. And it's about her Fay's story and, you know, how the sort of brush with death that led to Fay writing her memoir. So related to that, just a quick piece of news.
Just quickly, for context, hi. I just wanted to say that this was a very unusual publishing project. It was obviously a labor of love, and it was fueled by my mother's impending death looming over my head. So I can't recommend it, but it did work in that I think a lot of you are aspiring writers. You know the incredible single-minded focus it takes to produce a book, to edit a book, 20, 30 times, and then to go through the design process, all of that. And we did it both as a celebration that she was still alive, but also over time I realized it gave my mom another thing to live for, and I'm always looking for those. I just wanted to say that I really believed in this book because I believed in my mother's voice. I felt like the project started out as a legacy to her children and her grandchildren, and that's why the tone of the voice is incredibly intimate. And I think that's why people can relate to it, because it's like she's talking to one of us. When we started, Mom said, well, we should probably make 5 or 10 copies. And but I had a different vision, and I really sort of ran with the self-publishing tools that are out there, because I knew we didn't have the time to look for a publishing house. And so if you want to talk about any of that later, I'd be happy to. But we're really pleased because we got it from a sheaf of stories that had been edited in class, but were totally unconnected. We organized it into this thematic collection. It's not chronological, it's really thematic, which also distinguishes it from other memoirs. And the whole process took about 15 months of really concerted effort. So I think that's comparable to what a publishing house would do with a staff, but in this case, it was really just the two of us sitting across from each other at my dining table, day after day. I mean, literally, my family would come home and we'd just be in the same position as when they left. And honestly, the stories had always been, in my life, and we always thought we had time to do something with them, and then suddenly we didn't. And so part of this presentation is really to exhort you, if you also think you have plenty of time, don't waste any of it, because you just don't know. And the miracle of my mom having lived now gives us the time to do events like this, to talk about the process, but it's all gravy. I mean, we really didn't think we were going to have this time. And so I guess I just want to say from our experience that it's been so rewarding. And I thought I knew a lot about my family, but I didn't know a third of the things in this book. And so however you can, speak to your parents and your grandparents. I really encourage you to do it. That's it.
I feel like that's kind of like mic drop, and we're done now. But we can talk about other things too. So thank you so much for that. That was amazing. I guess that all kind of ties into my first question, which was that, so before we began, Fay and I were talking, and I was telling Fay that in my own family, and like a reason that it meant so much to me when I met Pearl Chow, who I wrote about, was that my parents, they came to this country in 1973. And they are overall pretty unreflective about the past. Not really on purpose or anything, but just, they're just like not interested. They're more forward looking. And I would always ask my mom questions about like her parents or life back in Taiwan or anything at all that happened before 1973. And she would just be like, oh, I'm so bad at history. So I just never had any sense of connection to the past. So I was saying that, and then Fay was saying, oh my gosh, like it's the opposite in my family. Like there was always so much storytelling in my family. And so I guess I'm just curious to know about the role of storytelling in your lives, both of you.
Well, my family is just the opposite. The sweetest memory I had was summer night. After dinner, we all sat outside to escape the heat. And there's incense for the mosquito. And I would be half asleep, and all the adults would be talking. And my dad was particularly unbelievable. You couldn't stop him. He loved to talk about the stories when he was courting my mother. And it gets better and better. And my mom and my aunt would sort of edit him. And so when I wrote about this, I actually went back to that porch, listening to my parents, my aunt always lived with them, listening to them talk. And I am aware that some of you don't have that tradition, but it's so valuable because I not only knew my parents' story, I knew my grandparents' story over and over again on both sides. So I guess it just lucked out.
Yeah. So for me, it's kind of the opposite, and I think it's because actually there's a lot of reasons. There's like the historical, intergenerational, living through different traumas, and then there's also just like whatever reason people don't like to talk about themselves. It's like all there. And so for me, I'm also trying to document my family stories. And during my travels, I went back to the villages that each of my grandparents were from in southern China, really with only a book of names of where these villages were. And it was on a search for questions that were not answered and that I might not have been able to answer, like had I not left New York City. So for me, like the family stories, they don't come streaming out, but they come when you least expect it. So like not when you have a recorder out, but when you're taking a walk from like one house to another, and then my uncle will just say something from like working back at the restaurant 40 years ago that, which is like, wait, I don't have anything to record that but my own writing, which is why I turn largely to like writing on paper and that creative type work because it doesn't always happen with a recorder.
I'm curious to know, like, so from collecting these stories or writing these stories, you know, it seems like hearing other people's stories brings out more stories, right, from other people around who are exposed to these stories. And I was curious to know what unexpected things have come up for you and what you've learned from doing all this. For example, you know, like I've heard some people mention like watching the new Ken Burns Vietnam documentary. That like, you know, people saying like, oh my gosh, like my mom never talks about Vietnam, and like then we watched this documentary and she's been telling me so many stories I've never heard before. So what sort of surprising things about your own life have you learned?
This one works too. See, she's so healthy now. She bosses me around.
Being bossy again. She said, I know you're getting better because you're being bossy.
I think the biggest realization for me was that my mother's entire childhood was running from potential death. I mean, you know, when I read the paper now about Syrian refugees, I don't feel like removed from it. I feel like, oh, that's my mom, you know? And even though I knew abstractly that the war was happening somewhere, we were looking for photographs for that chapter, and you saw the one we chose. And I said, Mom, this one is really heavy. I don't think we should put it in the book. It's going to freak people out. And she said, no, that is exactly. She saw dead people all the time and had to live in the bomb shelter for months on end. And she really, you know, felt strongly about not sugarcoating that, and it was very eye-opening for me, who thought I really, you know, I'm so political, I knew everything, and you know, it was very, I think, humbling to realize how much my mom went through, and she, you know, she presents as a very Americanized, hip Chinese 86-year-old, and yet when she talks about the war, it actually dawns on me that like she's a living link to you know, the early part of the 20th century when the whole world was at war, and I really value that, and you know, I'm kind of feeling like hyper aware that when you're gone, I'll be the one who has to make it immediate to my daughter. So, you know, you're just like a really important link to so many things.
And I would add that we sat across from the kitchen table and just talked about everything, you know, what to select or to the name of the book. And we probed each other's memory. She had been in Taiwan living with my mom, my aunt, and she and my mom became real buddy. So we were working and talking, and more little stories came up that she said, "Oh, Mom, I didn't know that." And some of it I forgot. I'm starting to write some of that down. And I have a little collection of the funny stories on my mother-in-law. You know, she is a unique lady. So I just got these little vignettes. And that's because I was talking to her so much. And it just came up. Maybe when you have your own family, establish a good tradition of talking. It's so wonderful, you know, it links you to your children and to all the people that came before you. And I felt I knew my two grandparents very well on mother and father's side.
So for me, in the process, I resonate a lot with learning all of these little stories that you didn't know before, and also learning about all of these people that I didn't know about before, but that who I'm connected to in the world. So kind of like before all of these questions about home and like probing into it, I guess like the idea it felt like was like me growing up, I go to this school, I have this family, there are this number of people in my family. But then when I get answers to all of these questions about what came before us, what came before you came to New York City, like everything started to change. And I also learned to situate my family in the history that I previously studied, but that was never taught to me in a way that's connected to my family. And so growing up in public schools, the US history textbook would be like, and then the Cultural Revolution happened in this year, and this is what went down in China. It wasn't until I got to college where I was encouraged to do oral histories that I was able to realize that my mom and my aunts were little kids during the same year. And so what were their stories? What were all of these narratives that weren't presented in the books? And then when I actually went back to China, it provided a lot of deeper context to have these conversations with them, because previously they would just tell me, oh, we lived here and then we went to school there and that's what it was like. But then when I actually went back to the physical places that I previously couldn't imagine, I then met these people who were friends with my grandparents when they were all in their 20s. And so I was able to learn about my grandparents and parents as children, which is this role that previously wasn't able to like conceptualize in my mind, just knowing them as these like familial figures in my life.
Yeah, that resonates with me too, because, you know, since I grew up thinking the world only began in 1973, so anytime I learned about like World War II or something like that, you know, it was like I couldn't connect with it at all. And then, you know, meeting not just Pearl Chow, but other people in their 70s and 80s who were like first generation Chinese immigrants has really placed history for me. And like I now see that, like, you know, like things that seem so far away, you know, when you hear someone saying like, oh yeah, my mother-in-law, blah, 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 or my grandmother, you know, was doing this when the bombs dropped or things like that, you kind of, you realize it's not so long ago after all. So it's really grounded me in history. I'm also curious, oh, well, you must get questions like this a lot, but how was the process of collecting the stories or writing your story? Like, do you have any sort of pragmatic tips for other people who want to do this?
Get yourself a daughter. That's a perfection. That's a perfectionist. she would get everything corrected. And if I tried to take a little shortcut, oh no. And she was in London with her husband and daughter, supposed to have a good time. She emailed me 3 times a day. Mom, do you like the version 3 better than the version 2?
That's because we had set the book release party date, and 2 of my friends had already bought their plane tickets. So it was like no turning back. I didn't want to spend my vacation that way, but you know, on the flip side, I didn't have to ask her to write. She had already written so many pieces. And I suddenly realized, like, oh my God, this is a treasure trove. Like, I can't just leave this in the folder. So it was very fortunate that I've done a lot of writing, editing, design. And so, like, between the 2 of us, you're a pretty tough editor too. And we mostly agreed. But a lot of the stuff that I think is geared toward younger generations, those were things that I thought were important, like having the pinyin, the Weijiles, and the Chinese characters like in a table in the back. And also, like, my mom gave me 4 timelines of the personal and professional timelines for her parents, and I was like, we can't have 4 timelines, you know. So there was a way in which I was looking at it as a reader, and we had to make that leap from this is a very internal family document to, hey, maybe somebody will buy this on Amazon if we do it this way, Mom. So it was like a really interesting process that way, and I think we both ended up pretty happy. We only had to hire the cover designer, a final editor, and the interior designer sort of came in at the last moment when we had some problems with trying to do it ourselves and the cover artist. So actually it was pretty cheap, and a lot of it was templates. So.
I want to add that there is a unique difficulty because I wrote all these pieces through many years, much longer than War and Peace, and each one is standalone. So when finally they were put into the book, I have to get all the redundant part out, and also historically they have to be coherent. So, but that was because I never planned to publish it as a book. And that was just my assignment. I keep turning in it.
I would say to backtrack to kind of where to start with oral histories. The thing you need is probably yourself and like the will to do it. That's really it, and like pen and paper. It would be nice to have a recorder. It would make things easier. Yeah, or your phone. And I just learned that on the Notes app on iPhone, it like transcribes what you record. So that's really useful to know that I didn't know before that. And I would also say sometimes like with projects like these, it can seem really daunting and like you don't know where to begin, or there's all of these things that come up, like you don't have time or you're too lazy. But I think like that's more about like a mental block that like I had to like work through, like what was preventing me from asking these questions, like what are you afraid of finding out, how will you approach like dead ends that you come upon. And so it's really just to start somewhere and then to follow that and go from there. And then you'll have a book and a daughter who will help you with your book.
So have a daughter and set a date for a book release party. Because then that'll motivate you to get it done. That's my takeaway. I don't know if I have more questions, because in a way you guys sort of answered all of this in different ways. But I guess finally I'll just ask, what is it what is it that drove you to collect these stories, to write all this down? Like, what do you think you were seeking by doing this?
Like I said, the foremost is I wanted them to know about my ancestor. I don't mean to brag, but my parents had very illustrious career. I wanted them to know about that as well. And they were really unusual people. They were the first Chinese youngsters being sent to this country separately, and then they went back. They fell in love, which is unheard of China at that time. And they were in education and physical education. They worked side by side together. So that again is so unusual, because most their friends had arranged marriages. And I really wanted to showcase them. And also because of their career, there are many articles written about them and biography. So that was easy for me to get the official records, like their work and everything is all described easily. So I guess it's my love for them, for my parents, and my love for my children. I wanted the two generations to know each other. And I throw in my grandfather. My maternal grandfather was so unique. He was the only one that saved my mother. My mother didn't have her feet bound. She was able to then go on, have a wonderful career, and she wasn't forced to marry some rich guy in their own hometown. I mean, these are forward-thinking thoughts at that time. And my mother was lucky enough to have a father like that. And my poor mother-in-law didn't have a father like that. So I wanted to show that at the changing time of China, I guess your luck plays a lot. And so that was my incentive to tell the story.
And now that it's been written, I can really say, I have great respect for oral history. I think that's really important. But a book is forever, and it's really difficult for me raising a child who is only, she only has one Chinese parent. It's so difficult for me to convey to her the connection that I feel, because I lived in Taiwan with my mom's mom. So I was almost like a 1.5, because I had that experience of being a Chinese kid in China. Then I sent my kid to Shuangwen in a vain hope, that would do it. And I can tell you that when she read this book, it changed her view of who she is. And I'm seeing that now. She's writing her college applications. And some of the questions are about your identity. And I think she has a much more concrete grip on not the Chinese, not the Chinese signifiers that she was formerly looking at, the language, the food, the holidays. Now she's looking at, what did my Chinese mother and grandmother give me in my character? That is a much more interesting way to think about your legacy. And this is a conversation that we're having right now, because I will freely admit that I don't think I've done a very good job on the signifiers. But that kid is definitely in this lineage. Her personality, her her sense of herself in the world comes from her Chinese foremothers, and that is something that is just priceless to me, that she understands that.
I'm also driven by these questions of legacy and trying to figure out who I come from in my lineages, and to also like write my family stories in order to share it with other younger family members who don't turn to writing and oral histories as a process to document. And I think like oral histories in general with my project, going to different countries, it's about highlighting everyday people who have contributed so much throughout their lives, but who aren't often highlighted when history textbooks are written or when news media goes to interview people. That's really like a driving force for me in order to preserve all of these legacies, and so that like younger selves and younger generations have that foundation to go from and to imagine like, I don't know, even bigger things.
Yeah, I definitely feel driven in some of my work to feel like I'm sort of filling in like gaps of history that, you know, maybe people I'm interviewing aren't represented in at all. Like, you know, it's when you meet in a really large Chinese community that has memories of the 1950s, and you think like, well, I watched old movies from the 50s and have never seen an Asian person in them before, you know, but here are like, here's like a whole community of them that were around, and there were 70,000 of them around. So yeah, 70,000 was up till about the 40s, but anyway. But I'm not sure where we are on time, so should we do Q&A? Okay, so Q&A time. If anyone has questions for any of these folks.
I was just curious, how do you then approach like a difficult mother or a father to convince them to talk? Like my mom would kind of brag or kind of lie sometimes about what to make herself look better in some of the family history, and you're like, that's not true, you know, and then you can't go to another source because, you know, you don't have other aunties around or whatever. So I was just kind of curious, and also to how to convince other older people to talk to you too. I was just kind of curious. You guys have any tips?
I think that what I found is it's really about building a relationship first before the questions and before the project or agenda of trying to document these stories. And I've found that like an interview with those questions will give you certain answers, but then with more time together, like with that person, different types of stories come out. Yeah, is what I've had in my experience. What else can I say about that? But I also like constantly wonder with the older like Chinese immigrant folks I know, like what really is the source of that barrier of like completely sharing and being completely open to that storytelling. It's a question I still have. Yeah, but I would say like spending that time together in person is like a crucial first thing, like more and more time.
I don't have a real answer exactly, but you know, I come across that a lot too, those kind of issues. And I guess one thought is if you interview a lot of different people, you get a lot of different perspectives. And if you end up with 10 different versions of what actually happened, like, you know, that's fine. That's like how life is. And you can sort of embrace like the fact that like, well, you're getting down the vision of herself, your mom wants to exist in the world. And the fact that that's the version she wants is like in itself like interesting, you know. And then another thing I've actually noticed is that sometimes the presence of an outsider is actually very helpful, or some just kind of like stamp of like officialness, or even just like an excuse to make them feel like they're not just like bragging or, you know, just talking about things that aren't important. So even if it's just like, oh, my, you know, niece has a school project and she has to interview people in her family about their history, will you sit down with her and or like get a friend of yours to pretend they're a journalist. I don't know. Like, but I've had situations where people say things to me in front of their family members, and then later their family members are like, oh, they've never said that to me, you know. So, yeah, for whatever reason, like of not wanting to toot their own horn or feeling like there needs to be like an official reason, like some outsider coming in to be asking them in some vaguely official capacity, like that helps sometimes.
I want to double amplify that. I found that it was easiest to talk to my family members when I was in college, and I would say, this is for an assignment, and I need you to help me to be successful in school for this assignment. So now that we're out of school, I feel like the equivalent would be some sort of like project that would launch your successful career, or like this grant you're writing, this article you're trying to get published. I found that those are really helpful outside motivators when they don't want to talk to you.
To address your question, you know, does that person look too good to be true? I guess that could happen. I strive to present a realistic picture. I think if you veer away from that, the readers would understand. And of course, some things I selectively neglected, like the black sheep of the family. I talked about it very little. So I don't know whether that answers the question. You know, if you read the Chinese, in China, when someone dies, there's always an official biography of that person. It's unbelievable. You know, this person's had to be the most perfect person on earth. You know, it's a wonderful son, wonderful father, and all that. And that smelled really fake. So I don't know whether that helps.
First of all, I want to thank you guys for your transparency and your stories and your research. My question is kind of along the same vein, but less in regards to how we build up like a qualification behind our questions. I feel like I'm in the same place as you, Huiying, in terms of finding myself really investigative and asking my parents lots of questions about their past. And I wanted to know, like, in terms of your journey going through all these different Chinatowns and your research, how is it added to sort of your probing and your inquiry to your relatives or your parents? I find that my parents are very literal in the sense that if you don't ask them, they won't share. It's not that they're not open to sharing, but it's just you have to ask them very specific questions. If your questions are too broad, they're going to answer you with broad answers, but they're not going to continue to, I don't know, excavate that. How has your research been able to sort of specify your inquiry to them to be able to, I don't know, discover more of that story?
I think the more I did these oral histories, the more they recognized me as like, oh, my daughter is going to be always doing these oral histories. You know, like it's not like a phase in college. And I want to say the more I delved into it, even though I didn't have all the answers, like just the more was shared. So after I went to Cuba, I was talking to my dad's mom. My grandma, just in general. And she then told me that she had a adopted older brother who went from China to Cuba before they came to the US. And I was like, Grandma, I was just in Cuba. Why didn't you tell me? And she was just like, why would I have told you? Like, you know, like, so there's no reason, and there's like stuff just happens. So now there's this like thread that I have to follow. Or even when I was in Peru, I was talking to my uncle who's here over WeChat, and then he was like, oh, now that you're there, I actually have a classmate from Toisan who moved to Lima to open up a Chinese restaurant. Do you want to be connected? And then I was like, I was telling you I was going on this trip for all these months and you didn't tell me that. So it's really like, once things happen, they just continue to happen. And if I didn't do any of that, like, I don't think I would have learned any of that.
So first of all, thank you to all three of you for sharing your stories. Towards the beginning, some of you were talking about writing and oral history and storytelling generally as having some healing or rehabilitative power. And I was just wondering if you encountered that in any way during your processes and your experiences.
Well, in a very literal way, yes. I think it was very healing for my mom to have a project that felt like a legacy project that she had to finish and that mattered to her survivors, really. And for me, obviously, this has been the most profound project I've ever worked on. And it just kind of keeps opening up in new ways. It is hard to really overestimate, how this has kind of filled a certain kind of hole. And, it's going to fill a hole after my mom is not around. And you can see, like, the way that I'm talking a lot about my mom not being around, I realize is very unconventional. But that is because for 3 years, we've really had a conversation about the fact that she isn't going to be around forever. And having that right out on the table has completely changed my life and what I do on a day-to-day basis. So I'm going to make a little plug. There's a Let's Reimagine End of Life festival that is happening starting on Saturday all over New York City. There are going to be 322 events at letsreimagine.org. And my mom and I are doing a couple of events that are just exactly around how does it change your life to come right up to the edge of dying and then not die? And how does that affect your family? Because that's like a whole other Oprah show, as they say. And, I really, I feel much more evangelical about that even, because I feel like I was asleep before. I just thought I had all the time in the world to do everything. And now I make very hard choices every single day, to spend time with my loved ones, to do things that are creative for myself. I take much better care of my own health. So things that just really didn't seem urgent at all are now. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's a big preoccupation of mine.
Wait, excuse me, I'm hard of hearing. What was that? How was the process healing? Just tell you what my thoughts were. I had worked at DuPont as a virologist for many years. We went to meetings and published papers. And you blink an eye, the field had moved forward. And most of my papers are yellow flowers of yesterday. I looked at it, I Googled them. Who cared? they're already gone. But at least I felt, okay, before I die, I got some of the stories out. And so my kids can have them. And to me, it's very comforting to me. I don't know what that answers your question. I was telling Monona, I said, oh my God, that's my only accomplishment at this time of my life. There's a warmth to it. And because the working on the book tied us all together, and into, as well as the question of death and dying. So it did open up a lot of new thinking in my head. And I think it's because of the book. And also, I'm 86 years old. I loved folk dancing. I can't do it anymore. You know, I'm a potted plant. I'm just in the corner. I can't move. I have to figure out what to do to amuse myself. And I think that's a real effort. Anyway, that's the change. Yeah, well, I don't like the change, but what can I do? I'm still gonna have to make my life as good as I can within the limit. And I think writing the book did help me. And
I would also say the process was healing, but unfortunately I can't say it's because I feel like a potted plant. Don't cry. That's funny. I think it was healing for me because it just answered all of these questions I had. So in some ways, I feel like a lot of the existentialness about like where we come from and who we come from has been calmed a little bit. But I would also say it's healing because now I am in this like messier process, right? So like how it's healing isn't that I had this idea, I got funding, I did it, and everything's great. But it's that I entered this, and then it got really messy, and there's all of these like emotional complications, like don't write about this, between everyone, and so it makes things messier. But like that stuff was always there, but now it's just like kind of uncovered, right? And so now I find myself able to write about my grandmother in the context of the Cultural Revolution and better understand those traumas that are still carried, that were always there, but were never uncovered before this.
One thought I have is about I guess it's sort of like healing, but there's like a sort of community forming role that sharing stories tells too. So I know this woman who is in her 70s, and she collects oral histories from her peers who grew up in Manhattan Chinatown during the 1940s through 1960s. And it kind of just started out as her just like bringing her iPad out to like get-togethers and trying to record them. But then she started bringing her grad students and this and that, and it like took off, and now she's been collecting all these oral histories. And I've been volunteering to help her. But it's really interesting to see how it's like formed. She's a psychology professor, so she kind of talks about this in her work, but how it's like formed this sense of community and identity for everyone. And so, you know, at these get-togethers, like I'll kind of like meet people who say like, oh, well, you know, I'm part of the Chinatown 1940s through 1960s crowd, like I was there. And it's it's like this like thing and about them that they now feel is like special and meaningful, and it drives more of them who weren't interested in participating or contributing in oral history at first to now also chime in and share stories too. So and that's another thing, I think, seeing your peers telling stories, it kind of like jogs a lot of memories in their heads too. So anyway, those are just some vague thoughts.
I think we have time for one last quick one.
So it struck me that Huiying, you're exploring the stories of your elders partially in Cantonese, and Fay, you were transmitting the stories to your descendants in English, and I think that puts you both in somewhat unique positions in the conducting of oral history. And I was just curious as to times at which language was either a barrier or a connection between generations in your own personal experiences through your storytelling.
Huh. It's interesting. When the kids were growing up, they spoke only Chinese. And then when I yelled at them, I spoke only English. There's something about English that allows you to say things without really hurting the people. Well, in Chinese, it... I mean, I'm hard of hearing, so I didn't hear your question so well. And I am really embarrassed to say that I did not push my children to speak Chinese. I have friends who raise bilingual kids just by speaking Chinese to them. I think it's very, very important. And she is pretty good. My son speaks kitchen Chinese. I could have tried harder. And I just... Okay, let me have it. I want to say something. Yeah, I just think there's so many beautiful idioms and Chinese poems, Chinese sayings are so clever, to the point. I've always thought about that. I said, oh, I could translate it in English. But that's something I hope will not be lost because it's so beautiful.
Yeah, I would say language is really complicated. And it's complicated because being born and raised in America, it's just not encouraged to speak your home dialects or languages. There's nothing for that in schools where kids spend most of their growing up lives. But for me, I was really fortunate to be raised by my grandparents while my parents were working. And so from them, I learned how to speak Toisanese. But I would say my language, it's something I'm still working on, and it's one of my life goals to become fluent in Chinese, in Mandarin, Cantonese, and Toisanese. I think in the writing I read, some of it was in Cantonese, but my paper was the romanization of the words. It wasn't actually the writing out of words. Even if I were to learn Mandarin, some Cantonese phrases are only spoken, and so they require different words. Yeah, so language is really hard and complicated, right? But you can learn Chinese characters really slowly, little by little. If you're Chinese, I don't know if you're Chinese, but I downloaded this dictionary called Pleco, which has words in Cantonese, Mandarin, and English. So it's been super helpful. And when I was in China, I would literally type in a word and then press the speaker button and listen to what the dictionary lady was saying about how to pronounce it. And then I would have my conversation and continue. And the less I became ashamed of this, the more people were just like, oh yeah, you have this dictionary, words are hard, let's keep talking. Yeah.
For the record, I studied Chinese for years as an adult, and I learned it. I was doing high school level Chinese when I left Taiwan, and I've lost a lot of it now, but I guess you have to be motivated to want to speak to somebody who is on the other end, who is monolingual or is just a different person in that language. And so for me, it was really important, more for identity formation. It was only, in the last year that I've thought about how unusual it is that my grandmother was a student at the University of Wisconsin in 1920. She was a student at the University of Wisconsin in the 50s, and I was a student at Shifan Daxue in Taiwan. So we had 3 generations of women in our family who were pretty bilingual, written, spoken, and it's some of it is circumstance, some of it is effort. But like when I talk to my daughter about it, I mean, she sort of knows like it's on her. I didn't stand over her and force her to do anything. And so it's really her choice if she wants to have that experience of being native someplace else. For me, she knows it was super important because I grew up in a completely white community. And being Chinese in China just totally changed my sense of being marginal. And so I needed it for that. It wasn't only a linguistic question.
Unfortunately, we are out of time. But if people have more questions, I'll be lingering around. I don't know if you could stay out late, but so come have a glass of wine and chat with us.
I just want to say, I have these little shoes for the bound feet. You might want to take one. This is how small the feet were.
And I'm going to make a shameless plug as a self-publisher. A great holiday gift for your parents would be a copy of this book in the back, signed and everything. Thank you so much for coming.